Welcome to the Spiritual Phoenix Podcast. I'm your host, Ross Cessna, and I bring you a weekly podcast about alchemy, spirituality, magic, mysticism, and more. Please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like our videos. Welcome, everybody. We are joined today with Katie DeMar of GnosticWitch.com. Katie, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Besides these massive the learning curve on this audio stuff, I am doing well, thank you.
That's great.
One of the very beginning questions I like to ask anybody before we get involved in the interview is, what are you grateful for today?
Today I am grateful for having just a roof over my head, being able to have food to put in my belly, and my cat, who gives me a lot of comfort.
What is your cat's name?
Gato. Well, her actual name is Dr. Braubeck, because my husband has this sort of family tradition of naming their cats, his cats, after characters from William Burroughs books. And so I think Dr. Braubeck is from Naked Lunch, I believe. Is a character in Naked Lunch? I could be wrong. But then we jokingly called her Gato just for kicks.
So one interpretation of Gato is cat in Spanish, right? But it's also part of that song Domo Arigato, Mr. Roboto.
Yeah, so we use the Spanish word for cat, and how this joke kind of spun out was when we got her, we were watching this Belgian sort of supernatural mystery show, and I can't remember the name of it now, but the main character's name was Kato, and it's Kato, and so we were calling her Kato because cat, but it's well, we can just go with Gato because that's basically what Kato sounds like, and so, or similar, and so then that name stuck. And she would not respond to Dr. Braubeck. She would respond to either Girly or Gato, and so she kind of chose that name for herself.
Yeah, she kind of shit on your husband's family tradition. She was like, I don't want to participate in this.
She's like, no William Burroughs for me.
I've only ever read one Burroughs book, and it was Junkie. I'd like to read more of his stuff.
Yeah, I actually haven't read any. My husband got me The Cat Inside for my birthday one year, and it's still sitting on the shelf waiting for me to crack it open. So, one day.
Very, very cool. Have you ever read any Kerouac? Because you know that Kerouac references Burroughs a lot, correct?
I do know that. I haven't read a lot of Kerouac either.
Oh, no. This interview is over. No. So, because I don't really like to pry into a lot of people's work before I talk to them, can you explain kind of who you are and what you do currently?
Right. So, in my professional life, I work at a historical society, and I'm what's called a public historian. So I, from a very young age, was just really interested in the humanities and studying other cultures, studying other people and how they make sense of their experience within the larger context of human history. And what differs a public historian from a academic historian is that public historians have the same training as academic historians, but they take their research out into the public sphere. So whether that's making podcasts, making documentaries, working at a museum or historic sites, or putting on public events, they often work in the nonprofit sector versus academic historians who work largely in academia and higher education. And so I was trained as a curator to create exhibits, but right now I help coordinate an educational program for teenagers to think about history critically and to study what their interests are, their own passions, and study the history of that. But then on the private side is um, I also have this long-standing history in uh, occultism because I was basically raised in the New Age community, and that has spurred off into so the last year, and it's going to continue this next few years. I'm studying under um, this um, community up in Seattle called the Cunning Crow Apothecary and Crow Song Healing Arts to basically become what used to be called like a cunning person or cunning folk in Northern Europe, whereas you're able to work within the spiritual realm, but then also give counsel and make rituals for others to bring healing into their lives. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Very, very cool. Do you find that the two kind of overlap? Because I would assume that being taught how to kind of study history in itself and then learning these different techniques in occultism kind of go hand in hand in some way.
They do, and I didn't see the correlation to that like when I first started going on to my professional role. Like when I decided that I'm actually going to pursue this degree in history, I wasn't thinking about that at the time, but over the years I've been able to just reflect that um people I think sometimes don't understand so there's this phrase of like revisionist history, and there's this idea that revisionist history is somehow wrong. But in reality, we're always revising history because we're always taking in new perspectives into how we tell the past, how we make understandings of the past, and maybe new evidence is coming forward, whether it's some unknown document that was just, or um, right now moving moving aside of how we've talked about stories in the past and letting people who actually have that firsthand experience be able to tell their stories, their own history. So rather than coming, so for example, one thing that we're dealing with at my work right now is how do you talk about Lewis and Clark without reinforcing the narrative of white colonialism across the United States? How do you tell that narrative by shifting the focus to be on the indigenous communities that were encountered and how have they made sense of this expansion westward, and what is that story? It's still the same story, it's just a different perspective from the same story. And that's a lot of what New Thought, the religion that I was really raised in, and what a lot of spiritual but not religious people hold on to, is this concept of like law of attraction and being able to retell your story to bring in a new state of being.
Oh wow, the way that you presented that was like completely different than like the level that I thought it was on. But what you're saying makes so much sense in the sense that like a lot of what the whole concept of spirituality is on like a deeper level is stepping outside of your comfortable paradigm of seeing things and even outside of the common one and trying to get this alternative perspective and kind of incorporate the whole experience like from a outside standpoint. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, I mean, and the problem with that, and this is it's a both the beauty and the problem, is that we will always be revising. Like there will never be there. You can you can follow. There are certain things where evidence will lead to this. There is no, how do I put this? We know, historians know that a lot of basically what is the rise of modern racism comes from the years of colonialism between the 15th and 19th centuries. That part can't be really um, debated because the evidence is so profound. But maybe, like I said, what the place, the historical society I'm working with right now, maybe the way how we tell stories from beyond that. So, like, how are we talking about the way how Lewis and Clark, how do we tell other stories like Lewis and Clark in a way that doesn't just reinforce this idea that West equals expansion, that the frontier is something, that the frontier, that concept within itself implies that to the west of the frontier is uncivilized society versus to the east of the frontier is civilized society, and that really wasn't the truth. The frontier is just a myth that we've made up to justify the colonialism that went westward.
That's a really interesting perspective. One of my aunts is a college historian, and one of the things that, or she's a college history professor rather, and one of the things that I really find frustrating with her is because she's become so entrenched in this one outlook on everything, where it's just kind of regurgitating stale facts, and the inability to kind of view history through this fluid concept. It kind of like what you're saying, I guess, is that history, the way that we can look at it is fluid, but there are certain facts that are undeniable, but you can still look at them through a different lens to get different information.
And a lot of that is just opening the way to get other perspectives in. And it's hard on a macro scale, like talking about US history, but it's also hard on a micro scale when we're talking about spirituality and being able to retell new stories or take a new perspective and shift the direction that you want your life to go. Like being able to take a step back and be able to look at a situation from different angles is very hard, but really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. One of the ways that I thought that history really tied into spirituality would be the study element of it, or like occultism and stuff like that. The study element of that, because there's this common misconception, in my opinion, that's portrayed about spirituality that really is, it's all like incense and crystals and like feel good shit, which, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm burning incense right now with an altar full of crystals and stuff behind me. Like, I'm not knocking any of those things, but it really is a lot of study of older texts, older concepts, and then filtering it through your current experience. And then also like studying yourself on a deep level. Has that been your experience as well?
Yeah. So a lot of that is just dealing with critical thinking and being able to read sources from various perspectives, being able to then say what this person thought about themselves and what are they saying without just regurgitating the same words that they said. So what are they saying within your own words, and how are you making sense of what they're saying? And that you don't have to agree or disagree 100% with everything, that you can agree with certain aspects and you can agree with other aspects. But more importantly, like always don't get in, don't get stuck within fundamentalism that these are facts. And I think spirituality has, well, at least New Age in general, has this tendency to want to prove things scientifically to the point where it's almost like a maniacal obsession, where we need to prove this as a fact, when really, for me, spirituality is something that is meant to be subjective. It's individual it's unique to each individual. And so when we get stuck into thinking that things need to be proven or there's only one way to experience things, we're missing out on, we somehow think that we have all the answers when in reality, we don't. There's a quote by Philip K. Dick that I love a lot, and it's the problem with introspection is that it has no end. And I think that is so true, that like you will never reach the final moment. There will always be more to go through.
Yeah, I have definitely found that to be true in my life. Philip K. Dick's somebody that I want to kind of read a lot more of. And since you brought him up, and I wanted to ask this question anyhow, he identified himself, or maybe he was identified later as Gnostic unintentionally. What is your definition of Gnosticism, or what is the standard definition of Gnosticism?
Yeah, so how I think of Gnosticism is this. Um, so I think so. I'll give you two answers. So historically, Gnosticism was this movement that developed in the second to fourth centuries, and then had various waves later on, where it was developing alongside early Christianity, and it was bringing across these ideas, these similar myths coming out of the Judeo-Christian um, tradition, but it's more about moving beyond conformity and fundamentalism, where there's this unknown God that exists within all of us, and the path to get there and to know it is to look inside yourself. And similarly, I think Gnosticism in the more general expanse, in general terms, follows a similar line where maybe someone doesn't follow Gnostic scripture, but as long as they're doing that internal reflection to find truth within themselves, then that is of sort of the Gnostic idea as well, of finding that source of the divine within you, and then from that place, bringing that forth and embodying it into physical reality.
So in some ways, like just to simplify, it might be it's the study of oneself to seek the divine within.
Yeah, and I think I think that's a great way of putting it, of becoming aware of that spark within yourself. And then, but I mean, like, I tend to fall into like, and then be a humanitarian with that. But then there are certainly other sects of that my husband has studied, where it's the sort of a satanic interpretation of Gnosticism called anti-cosmic Satanism, which he's talked about before, but I know I'm not the expert on anti-cosmic Satanism. But it does exist.
Maybe I'll have to have him on sometime and talk about it if he'd be willing.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm curious about it. And from my understanding, just in case people aren't familiar with Satanism, Satanism isn't so much the worship of Satan, it's the worship of self and fulfilling personal desires, correct?
Sometimes, yeah. So there's the Levian Satanism, which is more about, you are worshiping the self. It's basically like Ayn Rand with flair, but but then there's also other sects of Satanism, like Gnostic Satanism, that my husband got his PhD studying metal culture and various sects of Satanism within metal culture. So heavy metal culture, yeah.
That sounds fascinating.
We're a weird bunch.
Weirdness is a good thing. It's an underrated quality in society today.
Yeah.
One of the things that I want to say is, have you found that some of the New Age concepts actually almost mimic Levian Satanism in the sense of overvaluing the self and kind of they talk down upon the ego, but a lot of the way that they present information are kind of self-aggrandize. I might have said that word wrong, but like they almost idolize themselves.
Yes, I think. Okay, so let me back up and like explain, because I think, so I was raised in New Thought, which is this religion that started off in the 18th century that was all about law of attraction and seeing the divine within yourself, seeing God within, and New Thought was one of the various spiritual movements that led to what we now call New Age within since the 1960s. And as I see it, from about the 1980s until even today, a lot of that has dealt with, a lot of New Age has dealt with taking care of oneself, that really of being less about how one acts within the world, but then how one can care for their own needs. And so where it is important to take care of yourself and to value your needs and your wants, and to realize when culture is imposing its values on you versus your own values for yourself, a lot of the times I feel like New Age gets stuck there. It can't do this final movement of asking, well, how do I connect with someone human to human, heart to heart? It then the individual starts to center their own beliefs and their own mode of being versus lending an ear and hearing how someone else would want to be talked about. And so there's a lot of spiritual bypassing, and I think that there's also a lot of gaslighting as well, where someone would say, like, why don't you have more representation of people of color? And then someone else can be like, well, maybe you should get out of your ego. And it's like, well, that's not really an egoic statement. It's a legitimate statement, because we do need more representation. And I think it does definitely get stuck there often.
That's one of the things that, like, I've really found is that sometimes it's such a egoic circle jerk that there's like no real progress made for the individual, and that it becomes so self-focused where people are willing to cut people off because they perceive this other person as toxic because they can't have an authentic human connection.
Exactly. That, like, someone who might actually be just needing an ear to listen to, people will cut them off and say, well, you're draining my energy. I can't have your negativity around you. And we get into these, again, like, fundamental ideas of what is positive and what is negative, when in reality, it's all a spectrum. And really, sometimes the best way to go into healing is to be able to confront those unpleasant emotions within you, and you just go through it. Like, you don't dwell there, but sit with it until it passes, and then move on to the next emotion that is arising afterwards. And maybe that means, like, swallowing some pride. Maybe it means changing a worldview. Maybe it means taking some hard accountability for things that you said or ways that you acted that might have been disrespectful to another person. But I don't think that there's a sense of accountability within New Age. And that's sort of what I'm trying to do with the blog, is bring these two worlds that are meaningful to me, like my academic life and my spiritual life, and pull that two together within this blog. And a lot of that was coming from listening to interviews with Mitch Horowitz, who is a historian and essayist about who he identifies as a New Ager, but he during 2018 was doing a lot of public speaking about how this is a serious problem, that both within how New Age treats intellectual integrity, but then also well, it was mostly intellectual integrity, but I would add just that can lead into how we treat diversity within New Age as well.
I think the diversity within New Age is something that I personally struggle with at times. Not so much from a standpoint of not respecting other people's beliefs or their rights as individuals, but at certain times, I feel that privilege card or some of those other things are played to a point of nauseum. And then specifically because I'm a white male, it's easy for people to kind of shut down me trying to call somebody out on that because of I'm a white male. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that also leads to, I think, and this is only just something that I'm starting to realize within like the past few weeks, is that I don't think we as an American society know how to publicly talk about culture. That we want to think things are dualistic. So there's black and white, there's man and woman, there's straight and LGBTQ. And really there's a whole range. Identity is on a range of spectrum. So someone might be male and white, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have these same social privileges that we want to assume that all white men have. That maybe they have a physical disability. Maybe they have, I don't know, maybe they are gay, maybe they are trans. Like there's all of these identity issues that come up. And so we want to think about, so then we talk about culture and identity and privilege as these sort of parsed out things, but really we need to be talking about it like an ecosystem because women don't exist separate from men. And so if you want to talk about women's rights, you have to look at gender as a whole. Like, how do we talk about gender politics as a whole versus, you know, singling one side out and just talking about that without looking at how it relates to other aspects of identity.
Yeah, those are really good points. I because for me, like the whole issue that I have with it is everybody seems to think that I should be doing more for these causes, and I'm not saying that maybe I shouldn't, but a lot of the causes that I actively work towards, such as mental health and like substance abuse, they affect everybody of age, race, sexual identity, creed, religion, like all of these other things. So it's like I can only really do so much, and at a certain point I feel that people miss the point that if you fight so many causes, you lose your effectiveness in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, and I think you're not going to be able to talk about everything. Like, I definitely am not qualified to talk about addiction and mental health. But I think I can talk about culture from sort of a bird's eye view because that's what I've been doing for 10 years or so. And so it kind of just like, you're not going to be able to talk about everything, but you find the thing that you can do and you work the way that you can do moment by moment.
That's a very good approach. I'm going to ask one final question on this segment, and then we'll kind of transition into the second segment. And I'm just curious if you can maybe, what your perspective would be on a solution to have a better dialogue that could kind of be more inclusive and kind of, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Bring everybody in on the same level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of that has to do with what I was just saying of not looking, so like not seeing like talking about gender, not seeing culture as in a very dualistic sense as the way that we talk about it now. It's that we can't just talk about gender politics without also recognizing racial politics, because in the past, at least in the United States, when we talk about women's rights and the women's rights movements, almost always that only apply to white women. And so race does play a role in that. And so it's more of beginning to understand the spectrum, that there's a spectrum, that like that there's a fluidity between race, ethnicity, gender, able, are you an able-bodied? Are you passing as an able-bodied person? All of that identity is really on a spectrum. And if we're going, I think we do need to talk about these things, but I also think that we need to realize that the way how we've been talking about it is not necessarily healthy, because when you start singling out one group, then the other group is going to be like, well, what about us? And what about these things? That we need to pull back and see culture as this living organism that is constantly evolving.
So it's more about kind of seeing the larger picture of everything rather than pointing the blame, focusing on solutions and kind of finding a mutually agreeable way where we can confront some of the issues that we're facing.
Yeah, and not hiding away from the unpleasant truths that occurred. The fact that people of European descent did colonize a lot of the world. Like, that is a fact. You cannot deny that fact. And while I know that there are some white people who don't want to take accountability for that, I tend to disagree, and I tend to want to find ways to not retell the story that I've been saying, and finding perspectives from people of different ethnic and cultural backgrounds from me, and hearing their perspectives and raising that up to give an alternative.
So the solution, from what I'm gathering, the solution is almost kind of having some of those principles of Gnosticism, of kind of like self-reflection and getting deep with yourself and intimate with yourself on like a soul level. And then also somewhat of the spirituality element of being able to step out and see things from a larger perspective and see your piece as I'm stumbling with this, to see yourself as a piece of the whole and kind of get that larger vision of everything.
Yeah. I mean, being able to be able to recognize that, yes, you are an individual, but you are an individual within an entire sea of individuals.
I think that's a really good place to leave it for this first half. And when we come back, I want to focus more kind of on your upbringing in the New Thought movement, and kind of your experience with Gnosticism and the whole group that you're working with now. Does that sound good?
That sounds good, yeah.
Are you facing questions with no answers, or seeking an escape from persistent problems? Then enlist the Oracle at Mushin. The Oracle at Mushin provides high-quality tarot and life coaching services at affordable prices. Quickly and easily book online with the link in our description. Our listeners get a 10% discount off the Oracle at Mushin's already low prices. Use code OFF10. That's OFF10. Seek the solution today. And we are back with the second half with Katie DeMar. Katie, so I wanted you to, if you're willing to, I should say, I would ask that you explain some more of your upbringing with the New Thought, what that was like, and maybe some lessons learned or some important things from that period of your life.
Right. So I will sort of preface by saying that the New Thought, so how do I put this? I'm going to back up a little bit and explain what led the New Thought coming into the family that I grew up in. So, um, the years when I was 3 and till I was 8, so those 5 years were probably the most like tumultuous, I think, period of my life, and really set up where things would go um, from that point on, from when I was 8 until I was till now, basically. So when I was 3, my parents and I moved to Saudi Arabia because my mom wanted um, to teach English as a second language. When and we were there for a year, and then we came back home because it was 1989 and like Desert Storm was about to break out, um, and so we came back home to the United States, and um, I think that experience basically broke my parents' marriage. Like, that same year when I was 3, I had had like a major surgery on my hip because I was born with this condition called hip dysplasia. And I just think all of this tension from having this child with surgery to then just being isolated in this space of Saudi Arabia, total culture shock, um, didn't bode well for either of my parents. And so when we came home, within that same year when I was 4, my dad left to start a new family, and my mom and I were on our own. And my mom, I believe now, went through a major spiritual, what we call now a spiritual awakening. So she was raised Catholic by an atheist father and a Catholic mother. She had left the church, and then for a while she was trying to make sense of everything that had happened the last 2 years, she began to look towards spirituality. And for a while we were attending a Presbyterian church, and then eventually she found her way to the Center for Spiritual Living, which is a denomination within New Thought called religious science. And religious science is a movement that was founded in like the 1930s by this guy named Ernest Holmes, and it pulls a lot of the New Thought concepts in, where it's law of attraction, it's dealing with looking for God within yourself, but then also believing that it placed in a special weight on comparative religious studies. So whereas within the umbrella of New Thought, you also will have something called Christian Science, and Christian Science is all about like making like the word of Jesus is obviously very healing, but then also how can you use the word of Jesus to create reality, basically, too. Religious science was more about, let's compare Sufism with Christianity, with Gnosticism, with science, with or scientific thought, or in psychology. And so the sermons would range from any sort of like, almost always included New Thought teachers like Ernest Holmes and Emma Curtis Hopkins, but would also pull from the Gospel of Thomas, or would be reading from any sort of like agricultural book about like how plants will grow, for just abundance of like, why don't we be a little squash that's going to grow as strong as it can be to go against like any sort of like scientific experiments that like scientists are doing. So it was an unusual religious upbringing because much of the world falls within any number of major religions, and New Thought was definitely not one of them when I was growing up. And so it's weird to hear people who are now into New Age and be like, it's so hard getting to know people who are into this stuff, it's like, try being 12 and trying to find someone who is into this stuff, because I hear you.
I have a question that came up from all of that. It's interesting because it's something I wanted to bring up, but I didn't know how to bring it up. Is Sermon on the Mount actually one of those teachings that they kind of talk about in Christian Sciences?
I don't know, because I wasn't actually raised Christian Science. I was, so I'm a little less fuzzy about the specifics of Christian Science, other than I think Jim Henson was a Christian Scientist. That's about as far as I go with Christian Science, is the
Okay.
Muppets.
Yeah, I was just curious because at one point early on in recovery, somebody suggested to me that I read Sermon on the Mount. I forget who it's by, but they kind of filter it through this lens of Jesus being a mystic and not taking the words of it directly, but filtering it through and kind of looking at it from a philosophical and this different standpoint. And I've really been anti-Christian the majority of my life. But reading that book really shed a lot of light on good principles and knowledge because it was stepped away from the traditional understanding of it. I was just curious about that. Yeah, I can see though how like what you're saying, how difficult it would be, and honestly, within the New Age community, I feel like if people are having a hard time finding people that are affiliated with that in this day and age, they're not looking very hard. Like, there's an abundance of people. What specific thing or teaching or memory from that time period sticks out to you the most and is something that you still kind of resonate with? Ooh, I have one other question before I ask you that one. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you find that law of attraction is a watered down version of one of the Hermetic principles?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and a lot of that I think is that law of attraction has, as it's talked about today, is largely in line with kind of what I was talking about earlier with the 1930s or 1980s with the self-help movement. And I think often law of attraction, so it's two things. So it's approached by a very sort of materialistic standpoint of like, how can you generate the most money in your life, or how can you get like the next car that's so great, like the sort of vision board, practice, where it's like, I think vision boards can serve a purpose, but like it can be very materialistic if it's not reined in a little bit. And I think often it's talked about that in that way. And often with that also comes this tendency to want to place so much emphasis on how people are thinking, because so it's not even bringing into consideration maybe the emotions that are causing someone's ability to manifest or not manifest. And it also doesn't take into consideration the fact that our thoughts don't create the single aspect of our reality. So like my heart isn't beating because I'm thinking and willing my heart to beat. My heart beats because that I am a biological being that has a heartbeat. Or when I live in the Pacific Northwest, so when the big earthquake happens that we've been preparing for decades, when that hits, it's not hitting because I believe and I'm willing it to hit with my mind. It's because I live in the Pacific Northwest where there's these two tectonic plates that have, I mean, it's Earth. It's the Earth happening. And so to not put so much emphasis on the mind, think about other things that are creating the realities, such as physics, the environment, biology, but then also what emotions are you bringing into the mix as well?
Yeah, I think that those are very good perspectives. That's one of the things that like I really struggle with, because for me personally, when I first really tried law of attraction, I got in this habit of beating myself up for thinking things, which is completely counterproductive to healing in any sort of way. And then the other element of that is if you kind of transition into this space of kind of believing, or like switching your mind to where you're lying to yourself, essentially, that's destructive. And then if you're trying to suppress your emotions, that's destructive. And what I've really found personally is it's not one of those things that you can fake until you make it. You kind of have to let yourself go through your process, and intending to manifest things is kind of not the point of it. And a lot of people sell themselves short. And it's funny you brought up kind of the material aspect of it. So many people go to the spiritual thing for these material rewards, but they don't ever cultivate, what's the words I'm looking for? Maybe the internal resources to appreciate it on a deep level. So it's just getting all these flashy trinkets by trying to game the universe.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it is, I think, a part of this desire to be human and want to conquer nature. And really, within like the last 3 years, I have been incorporating more of sort of an animist worldview, where respecting an object for its own agency, or respecting nature for its own agency, that just because I'm a human doesn't mean I have the right to go lay claim over anything, really. An object, a plant, a rock. You know, it's funny, like, I mean, there have been times that I've been doing rituals where I'll have, like, a magical tool with me, and then, like, when the ritual is done, it's gone. Like, the thing just like, I don't know where it went, but whatever, like, it left me, and it's gone back to where it needs to go, and that, to me, is very special, where it's like, okay, yes, I have a crystal right here, but that's not my crystal. Like, I purchased it, but it is this being, essentially, that I don't have agency over. It can choose to go somewhere else if it wants.
That's a really interesting perspective. I'm grateful that you brought that up, because it is something to consider. And I've even heard that, like, we become so attached to our body and our lives at times, and we don't understand that we're even technically, like, leasing those on, like, a larger scale.
Oh, yeah.
We're just passing through. Like,
we definitely are. And that, like, this, absolutely, we become so attached to, I think it's important to be aware of your physical body, because it will give you indications about things that maybe you need to work through and whatnot. And this is the vessel that we're using to experience embodied life. But it gets, like, you know, I mean, I think this also goes into, like, health food and diet crazing. It's like, is it more important to be just nourishing your body, or is your goal to lose 30 pounds? I mean, it could be to lose 30 pounds, but I think this, like, this craze of, like, only eating superfoods, or only eating, like, protein shakes, or only juicing, like, that can go into a very toxic realm as well. Like, are you actually listening to your body and responding to what your body needs in this, from moment to moment?
I think that's
a bigger question.
No, I think that, I'm sorry for interrupting.
That's fine.
I think that's a very important perspective, and our culture tends to be on either end of the extreme spectrum in so many different things. And I know for me personally, when I stopped using substances and I started to address other issues within my life, I started to take other things on to extremes. Like, lately, the things that I've been trying to find a more realistic approach to would be things like eating habits and exercise, because from not doing those things or not taking care of those things for a long time, I bounced from the extreme of doing it to a point of, like, being self-destructive and making myself, like, miserable about it.
Mm.
And it's not about that. It really is kind of about like what is the intention behind why you're doing this? What is your motivation? And is it motivation based in self-love, or is it based on kind of this egoic standpoint? And most of the
Mm.
reasoning behind how I was approaching things was more from ego than it was from, am I being good to myself? Like, I think that people lose touch with that. I mean, I at least know that I have. And then I want to comment on the thing you said too, kind of about how we need to stay grounded in our body in some ways and not become kind of somewhat so detached. As somebody who's had periods of extreme psychosis where I've been completely like detached from physical reality in almost every sense of the word, yeah, I think that that's one of the things that people often overlook as well, is how much we need the material world to kind of, it's like the playing field for a lot of our experiences. And when we're
Mm-hmm.
not connected to physical reality on a deep level, we miss out as much as if we're not connected to the spiritual reality, we miss out.
Mm-hmm. I think, and I think that goes into how we interact with the world too. I mean, I think sometimes people want to go so far out into uh, listening to, how do I put this? They want to get, it's important to have a, like I was just talking about the bird's eye view, and the bird's eye view is important, but at the same time, you have to be able to come back down to the ground and interact and engage with even challenging topics, or maybe challenge. I mean, we live, we are always going to be faced with challenging circumstances, but we're never going to be. I don't think. I take that back. Like I was going to say something, and um, um, we will always come up with challenges, and more often, at least in the West, um, um, there will be ways of handling that. It's going to be easier for certain people than others, and I think we need to realize that. And if it's easier for you to handle certain things, then find ways to give back and help those who are not privileged. And we're living back a little bit towards the concept of privilege, but that is something that I really do think that is missing from New Age, is this humanitarian aspect of it, of like, again, take care of yourself, but also take care of those around you.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the things that like we have in somewhat common in some regards. Like a lot of the work that I do is kind of talking about my experience and getting other people on to talk about theirs and kind of shed an alternative view that might be able to help people find a different path than the one that's commonly presented. And from my understanding, that's kind of what you're doing with your blog in general as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so, what are some of the things that kind of led up to your blog? And let's talk about your blog for a little bit, if that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah, so I so um the inspiration from the blog actually came from an episode of the Positive Head podcast, which is a podcast that you and I both met through. Um, and it was this episode with an interview of Sevon Bomar. And it was this moment of synchronicity where that morning I was listening to, oh no, I was reading an old research paper that I'd written in graduate school about Hindu nationalist identity through the writings of the Theosophical Society. And I was doing this because I am writing curriculum about critical thinking in history and how to tackle historical, like long-term historical, year-long history projects for high school students. And so I wanted to get into that mindset of where do you. And then later that day, this episode with Sevon Bilmer was posted talking about, well, the podcast billed it as the something like the untold history of the Tamil language, which Tamil is a language in southern India. And it was this whole, like, hour-long, weird, convoluted discussion, basically, of Sevan Bomer concluding that the way how we're going to dismantle racism is learning the Tamil language. And I mean, you can listen to either the podcast of that episode or you can read my blog post about it. But I was sitting there at my desk at work, like kind of like convulsing of just like, what the hell? What the hell? Like, why? Where did this like lead to this? Or he's making like comments about how Helena Blavatsky was friends with Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler was 3 years old when she died. It's like blatant lying, and I'm like, where did this? Why don't people hold themselves up to a higher standard? Like, why do you have to pull stuff completely out of your ass in order to promote you? Like, why? And more frustrated that, like, people buy into that. And, like, there are people buying it. Like, the Positive Head podcast was buying into it and posting that out. And I was like, this is insane. And so that was just, it's ridiculous was what I mean to say. And that and like began to think about just who am I in relationship to these two worlds, where I do really hold a high value up to intellectual integrity, but I also hold up a high value to spirituality. And I know from being raised in the New Age, I know the reputation that New Age has, that like if you have a crystal, you might be seen as a little kooky. I totally am aware of that that stereotype, but at the same time it saddened me that like that is a stereotype, and that stereotype in some ways can be very, very true. And so wanting to, with this blog, was then to bring my voice forward as to talk about how you can be spiritual but not religious. You can be a new ager and not be, and still ground your experience in something that has an intellectual integrity to it, that isn't interested in pulling out the truth without completely lying to audiences.
Yeah, I regretfully can say that I haven't listened to that episode, so I almost want to kind of hear the shit show of it.
Yeah, it was challenging for me, and I don't know if anyone else had challenge with it, but it was, yeah.
I think that's good that you felt the call to action to kind of present more accurate information, and that you kind of took it upon yourself to use some of the knowledge and classical training that you have in the field of history specifically, to unite it with something else that you're passionate about. And I think that more of that's needed is kind of I think that's one of the issues that I have largely with some of the New Age movement, is that it's removed from critical thought on such a deep level, where
definitely
it's more grounded in a lot of airy-fairy stuff. And not to say that I don't have some airy-fairy experiences or beliefs, but I also try to find reflections of that in more deeper literature. And some of the things that I've kind of digested aren't all as pleasant maybe as like the Return of the Bird Tribes or Celestine Prophecy. Some of it is reading like a revised version of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky or Manly P. Hall, or like some of these very wordy scholars that have a lot of information that you have to kind of have experience to understand.
Yeah, and it's not that I am like totally like poo-pooing New Age, because it's a very dear part of my upbringing, and it's, that's one thing that I've had a challenge with writing the latest blog post, which was talking about this ritual that I did. It's like the first draft of it, I read it, I'm like, people are gonna think I am just completely woo-woo. Like I am completely woo-woo, but like I don't know how to explain the experience of this ritual while I was doing the ritual without coming off sounding completely way off in, my own sort of witchy world. And to that extent, like, that is something that mystics have been struggling with forever. Like, how do you explain transcendent experiences in mundane language? And it often comes down to you can't. So you have to turn to poetry or art or music or myth is where I think the Gnostics land, is like, how can you write myths? But at the same time, it saddens me that, well, this is something actually that Mitch Horowitz gets to, is that the reason why New Age is so often attacked is because, on one hand, there's no one there to defend it, no one there who can really stand up and say, well, no, these are the benefits that come from these teachings, without then turning totally into straight up lying and being a charlatan, like that's, it's had a hard time producing. He gives the Edgar Cayce Institute and the Theosophical Society as sort of the two main runners, but it's largely, well, he concludes, has had a hard time producing people who can speak publicly and intelligently about it to the masses, in a way that's honest.
I think that's interesting, because one of the things that I'm working on in my book is kind of talking about how some New Age concepts or kind of esoteric things actually have helped me get my life on track. But I missed the one caveat of talking about it in an intelligent way, because I'm kind of like a rapscallion in how I talk about things. But that is a good point. I think that a lot of that stuff is really grounded in some very sound psychological understanding as to how it can help people, even without looking at the metaphysical element of it.
When I say intelligent, I mean really, like, what we've kind of been talking about this entire time is a sense of self-reflection, a sense of who are you and who are you in relationship to others. And if you can say that, if you can define who you are and then realize that you are interacting with people who are trying to define who they are, then what you're doing is critical thinking. And that's really what I see is lacking in a lot of New Age circles. It's not always, it's there, but it's to a much lesser extent than what I think it could be.
That makes sense. I'm going to give you an option right now. We can continue this interview for another 30 minutes if you have the time, or we can kind of wrap it up now and then maybe have you come back on another time.
Well, why don't we maybe let's do another 15 minutes, because I know my husband we got to go do our grocery run and everything. So, but I'm having fun talking. So why don't we do another 15 minutes? Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's fine. I just got to take a quick break. Are you facing questions with no answers, or seeking an escape from persistent problems? Then enlist the Oracle at Mushin. The Oracle at Mushin provides high-quality tarot and life coaching services at affordable prices. Quickly and easily book online with the link in our description. Our listeners get a 10% discount off the Oracle at Mushin's already low prices. Use code OFF10. That's OFF10. Seek the solution today. All right, we are back for the third segment with Katie DeMar. Katie, I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know you got stuff you got to do. But one of the final questions that I would want to ask, amongst other things, is does anything stick out from your whole experience as a kid as something that you really hold near and dear to your personal philosophy and spirituality or life in general?
Yeah, let me think about that. Actually, yes. So when I was, again, about 8 years old, I had a hard time explaining what was going on, but at the time, so I had a hard time explaining what was going on at the time, but now, I think I have a better clue. So it'd go into these sort of like spontaneous, like trance-like states, where I wasn't completely out of my body. I was in my body, but I was aware that the person inside of me was not the person that was outside. And so there was this feeling of a detachment and trying to understand who was I this time? Like it really did feel like I had like this meat suit on and I'm staring out at these eyes, but these eyes really aren't mine. It's just a body, and trying to figure out like the facts of who am I? Like, I'm a girl. I have these friends. I have, and like really trying to figure out like who this avatar is. And for years I would try to describe that to people and no one knew what I was talking about. And I think now I can say that it was just these really bizarre transcendent experiences that I was just, where I was beginning to kind of come on that this reality isn't like,
it's not the definitive experience. There's a lot more that's
right,
going on.
That there's something else beyond, like I am something else that's come down here, and this is what I'm experiencing right now. But that's not, that's not, like you said, the definitive reality.
Yeah,
and so that has fed sort of this desire to know everything about spirituality ever since.
Yeah, you're like you're taking the Katie DeMar experience, but you're not Katie DeMar, like in right. The larger spectrum of things.
Right. Absolutely.
Very, very cool. Yeah, that kind of feeds into like the whole rune soup. Are you a weird kid? And I would say that you would. The answer to that for you would probably be yeah.
Yeah, I was a pretty weird kid. Like, yeah, if ever Gordon has me on a show, I'm like, I know what to answer for that one. Yep.
Yeah, I definitely thought of that. There's no way I could answer. Like, I don't think he's ever had anybody on that was like, I wasn't weird.
Yeah. Which is what's great about that question. It's like, of course, like if you're coming on to Rune Soup, chances are you were a weird kid.
Yeah, it's interesting because before I ever listened to him, I actually had a similar question that I asked people for a long time that was like that. And most people said that they were kind of different. But then it was also like some people would say they never really thought about it and that everybody's different. And thinking about it, I think kids are kind of weird in general. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. It's I like his question so much on that. One of the other things that I wanted to ask you about is kind of explain this whole coven thing, like in a brief way.
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it a coven because coven kind of implies that there is this shared belief system, and really it's more of a community that I'm involved with. So the community more broadly is part of this shop called the Cunning Crow Apothecary that is both a magic store, but it also has a healing temple that has a bunch of classes. And it really, I think more so than any other magic shop that I've ever been a patron to, caters towards all different types of magical traditions. So you have people like me who are coming from the more Gardnerian, Crowley, Western esoteric side, but the shop owner is of Romani and Slavic descent, and so you have this very Slavic and Romani influence to magic as well. And then there's people who identify as hoodoo practitioners, root workers, and then brujas, and so
Oh,
from
wow.
Latin America. So there's very multicultural in the sense of let's study magic from all of our various backgrounds. And the program is the class that I'm in is a 2-year healing craft program that basically is teaching magical practitioners how to um, be spiritual counselors to people, to the public. So it's, there is like divination and that kind of stuff, but and that was really what was the foundations of last year, different forms of divination and working with the elements and doing more personal research into magical practices of our various backgrounds. So I um, I've studied my Irish heritage in the past, but I really dug deep into sort of the um, syncretism of of religion in Ireland this past year, of really appreciating these sort of pagan bedrock of it that then got transmitted into Christianity within the 5th century, and seeing both of the religious experience in Ireland from the Christian side, but then also the pagan origins. And then this year is crafting, learning how to craft rituals around um, uh, times of transition throughout life. So this month we were learning how to craft rituals for birth, because one of my classmates just had a baby, so that was just a natural thing of like, okay, if we are going to start practices and a pregnant woman comes to us, how do we begin to start the counsel of either the birthing process, but then also if they want a blessing of the baby, then what are the best practices to be able to go ahead and do that.
Hmm. That sounds incredibly interesting. Like a whole. I mean, I'm fascinated by all of what you've just said. Because we're limited on time, I'm going to ask one question on it specifically. Maybe I can get you back on another time where we can kind of focus more on the training and more of some other stuff as well. But the question I want to ask is, in interacting with these people from various different practices, have you found that a lot of them are kind of approaching this for some of the same results through different methods?
I don't I guess I don't necessarily feel comfortable answering that question, because I don't want to speak for someone. I don't want to speak for someone else on why they've chosen to uh, pursue a particular religious spiritual path that they've chosen. I know for myself, it was a matter of, after years of being just a solitary practitioner, I became aware of my own limitations, and that, just like with any sort of trade, that if I wanted to pursue it further, then I would need to find a teacher who could help guide me into the more advanced levels of ritual. And I think I totally found that.
Very, very cool. One last question, and then I'll kind of let you close everything out. In your own opinion, do you kind of view the concept of witchcraft and all of that for you personally as more of a different means of healing and getting to know yourself on a deeper level that then you can share with other people, more so than power related?
Yeah, I mean, I think when done ethically, it's definitely a part. Like, I think ritual is a very powerful and quick way of um, entering new states of being. So, of embodying magic within you, and then um, um, rather than, I mean, you can do that the slow way, which I would think is, for me, is law of attraction and trying to just change your mindset. Or you can go into a 2-month meditative ritual that takes 2 months or so to gather all the supplies and get into a meditative state and clarify what it is that you want to become, and then have that build up to a 5-minute actual ritual that within you then all of that energy that you've been building up for 2 months becomes embodied within you. And that is my sort of favorite mode of becoming anew.
This is for real my last question, because I don't want to go over 15 minutes. But have you found that, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Have you found that ritual in your own personal experience to be more kind of about materializing the shifting of thought processes and stuff like that?
I think it can do. I think it can do thought processes. I think absolutely. I think it can also help change maybe relationships that we have in our lives. I think it kind of just all depends on what is the intention of the ritual. And at the end of the day, I think all ritual is very transformative. It's just a matter of what the intention behind the ritual is, I think.
Yeah, because for me, I think my concept of it at this stage in my practice with everything is that it's kind of a material way of tinkering with the mind and the perception of reality. And sometimes by tinkering through that, you get different results in material reality, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think you can do a ritual, but then you might not necessarily know how it's going to manifest, and that's sort of the fun. It's like, okay, well, I built up all this energy, I did it, and I released it, and now we play the waiting game to see what comes from this experience.
Very, very cool. I don't want to run over any longer. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Besides your blog, which is gnosticwitch.com, do you have any other links that you'd like to share with people or anything like that?
No, I mean, people can, if they want to talk to me, they can contact me through Facebook, Katie DeMar. And so that's usually just I tend to try to limit myself to social media, and so that's kind of the only social media platform that I'm really active on.
I completely understand. Yeah, so I'll put those links in the show notes and all of that good stuff so people can kind of get a hold of you easily. I really want to thank you for taking the time and chatting. Hopefully you can come back again sometime.
Yeah, that would be fun.
And I normally ask the guests to close us out with their own little bit of wisdom or however they want to end the show, so the platform is yours.
Okay, well, just keep going internally, people. Like, the more internally you go, the more you'll discover about yourself, and the more you can bring just healing to where it needs to go, whether or not it's releasing thoughts of self-doubt or anger or or establishing boundaries and getting angry and saying that that's not okay and this is why. If it's someone who is treating you wrong, spend some time with yourself to determine what is needed to bring healing magic to any given moment.
Thanks for listening. Please visit the links in the description below. You can support this podcast through PayPal, Patreon, Venmo, Anchor, or through our shop and services.